On August 12th, 30 BC, Roman soldiers forced their way into the sealed doors of a mausoleum in Alexandria. Inside was Cleopatra VII, the last reigning monarch of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a woman who had ruled Egypt for 22 years and now found herself trapped inside a tomb she had ordered built for herself. Outside those walls waited Octavian. The man who would soon be known as Augustus had spent years pursuing her across the Mediterranean. He had shattered her fleet at Actium, seized Alexandria, and driven Mark Antony to suicide. Now, at last, Cleopatra was cornered. What followed over the next 11 days, ending with her death on August 12th, would expose a level of calculated cruelty that later Roman historians worked carefully to conceal. The official story presents a serene ending. A proud queen, defeated but dignified, choosing death by the bite of a sacred serpent. The reality preserved in private letters and first-hand accounts is far darker. To understand Cleopatra's fate, it is essential to understand what she represented to Octavian. She was not merely a defeated enemy. She embodied everything Rome publicly claimed to despise and privately feared. She was a woman who ruled without male oversight. She commanded immense Eastern wealth that mocked Roman ideals of restraint. And most dangerously, she possessed dynastic legitimacy that rivaled Octavian's own ambitions. Mark Antony's alliance with Cleopatra and his recognition of their children as legitimate heirs to Eastern territories had created an intolerable precedent. Cleopatra was not simply a queen. She was a living challenge to Roman authority and to Octavian's vision of a world centered solely on himself. Killing her outright was not enough. What she symbolized had to be dismantled, publicly and completely. That required something far more elaborate than a swift execution. When Roman soldiers burst into the mausoleum, Cleopatra was accompanied only by her two most loyal attendants, Iris and Charmian. According to Plutarch, who later accessed sources close to the event, Cleopatra attempted to kill herself immediately. This moment is often romanticized. In reality, it was brutal. Cleopatra was not gently restrained. She was physically overpowered. Her clothing was torn during the struggle. She was dragged from the tomb in full view of Roman officers whom Octavian had deliberately summoned to witness her capture. This humiliation was no accident. It was the opening act of a carefully staged spectacle meant to break not only the woman, but the myth surrounding her. Cleopatra was taken back to her chambers in the royal palace of Alexandria, now occupied by Octavian and his command staff. The palace that had once symbolized her authority had become a prison. What followed were a series of encounters between conqueror and captive that revealed the raw mechanics of power behind the polished narratives of history. Octavian visited Cleopatra personally the day after her capture. At least 3 Roman officers were present. Fragments of their testimony survive in later historical accounts. This was not a negotiation. It bore no resemblance to the dramatic exchanges depicted in modern retellings. It was an interrogation. Octavian laid out her options with deliberate clarity. The first path was complete submission. Cleopatra would surrender all remaining royal treasures. She would publicly renounce any claim her children held to power. She would agree to be taken to Rome. There, she would be paraded through the streets in chains during Octavian's triumph, displayed as a living trophy of Roman victory. In return, Octavian promised her life would be spared. Her surviving children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and the young Ptolemy Philadelphus, would not be executed. The second option was never spoken aloud, but it was unmistakable. Refusal meant immediate death, not only for Cleopatra, but for her children. the total extinction of the Ptolemaic line. Egypt reduced fully to a Roman province. Cleopatra asked for time to consider. Confident in his control, Octavian agreed. What followed over the next several days demonstrated both Cleopatra's intelligence and the ruthless system closing around her. She did not confront Octavian directly. Instead, she began working through his subordinates, particularly Cornelius Gallus, the officer assigned to guard her. She offered bribes. She made promises. She attempted to exploit fractures within the Roman command structure. At the same time, she made requests that appeared harmless on the surface. Permission to visit Mark Antony's tomb. Access to medicines to treat injuries from her capture. The constant presence of her attendants. Each request was calculated. Cleopatra was assembling the only control she had left, influence over the conditions of her own death. But Octavian was not easily deceived. Informants reported Cleopatra's bribery attempts. More troubling to him was her refusal to eat. Roman physicians were sent to examine her. They reported signs consistent with suicidal intent. It was then that Octavian deployed his most effective psychological weapon. He ordered Cleopatra's 3 surviving children brought into her presence under guard. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, had already been executed in secret days earlier, though Cleopatra had not yet been told. The message was unmistakable. Any attempt at suicide would result in the immediate death of her children. For the first time in her life, Cleopatra was completely powerless. The woman who had navigated courts and empires through intellect and persuasion found herself trapped by a threat she could neither outmaneuver nor endure. Her psychological deterioration during these days was recorded in disturbing detail by Olympus, her personal physician, whose account survives in fragments quoted by Plutarch and Cassius Dio. He described how Cleopatra maintained composure during official visits, only to collapse emotionally when alone with Iris and Charmian. She inflicted wounds upon her arms, hidden beneath long sleeves. She abandoned her appearance, something unheard of for a woman who had always understood image as a political tool. Most disturbingly, she began to hallucinate. She spoke as though Mark Antony were present. She held imagined conversations with him, sometimes addressing empty spaces in the room. On August 5th, 6 days after her capture, Octavian visited Cleopatra again. This meeting was different. Her physical decline was obvious. Her face showed signs of trauma, exhaustion, and sustained psychological stress. Over several hours of conversation, she appeared to surrender. She agreed to cooperate fully. She revealed the locations of hidden treasures. She provided detailed information about Egypt's administration that would facilitate Roman control. Satisfied, Octavian relaxed the guard around her. It would prove to be a fatal mistake. Cleopatra had not capitulated. She had entered the final phase of a desperate plan. What she intended exactly remains debated, but the evidence suggests she was not simply planning her suicide. She was attempting to ensure that her death occurred on her own terms, and crucially, that it could not be exploited by Octavian in the triumph he so desperately wanted. The Roman triumph was not merely a celebration of victory. It was a political ritual, a performance of domination. To parade Cleopatra alive in chains would have been the ultimate symbolic conquest of the East. Cleopatra was determined to deny him that victory, but any obvious suicide attempt would doom her children. She needed a death that appeared unavoidable, or at least beyond the ability of her guards to prevent. And so she waited. In the final days before her death, Cleopatra appeared to change. On August 10th and 11th, Roman guards and attendants noted a visible shift in her behavior. She began eating again. She spoke more freely. She discussed practical arrangements for her impending journey to Rome, even asking questions about logistics and protocol. To those watching her, it looked like acceptance. To Octavian, it appeared her spirit had finally broken. But this transformation was deliberate. Cleopatra was performing one last role, drawing on the same skills that had sustained her through decades of political survival. Only now, she was not fighting to preserve power. She was shaping the conditions of her end. By convincing her captors that she had accepted her fate, she created the narrow opening she needed to act without placing her children in immediate danger. On the morning of August 12th, Cleopatra made her final request. She asked Octavian for permission to visit the tomb of Mark Antony one last time before departing for Rome. She framed it as a farewell, a final act of mourning before submitting fully to Roman authority. Octavian agreed. Confident in his control and reassured by her recent behavior, he granted the request without hesitation. What happened later that day has never been fully clarified. The version that entered popular memory speaks of a serpent hidden in a basket of figs, a queen choosing a poetic death by the bite of an asp. But this story, repeated for centuries, collapses under scrutiny. First, snake venom, even from species known in Egypt, rarely kills quickly or peacefully. Death is typically prolonged, painful, and unpredictable. Second, Cleopatra was known to have studied toxicology extensively. Multiple ancient sources attest that she experimented with poisons and carefully observed their effects. A woman with that knowledge would not entrust her death to an uncontrolled animal. Most telling of all is what Roman guards discovered when they entered her chambers. Cleopatra was dead. So were Iris and Charmian. The idea that a single snake could kill 3 adult women in such a short span strains credibility to the point of fantasy. Modern toxicological analysis, combined with a re-examination of ancient accounts, points to a more plausible explanation. Cleopatra likely used a fast-acting poison, possibly a prepared mixture involving concentrated opium, hemlock, or another potent plant-based toxin. Marks later described as snake bites may have been pre-existing self-inflicted wounds or even injection points. Introducing poison directly into the bloodstream would explain the rapid, relatively calm deaths of all 3 women. The serpent story may not have been invented solely by Roman propagandists. It is possible Cleopatra herself encouraged it. A death associated with a sacred Egyptian symbol was more dignified, more mythic than a straightforward poisoning. It allowed her final act to retain royal and cultural meaning, even in defeat. But the most disturbing aspect of Cleopatra's death is not how she died. It is what followed. When guards discovered the bodies, Octavian was informed immediately. His reaction, according to multiple sources, was one of intense rage. Not grief, rage. Cleopatra had denied him the political prize he desired most. Without her alive, the triumph he envisioned lost its centerpiece. The symbolic conquest of the East was incomplete. Octavian ordered his physicians to attempt to revive her. When that failed, he briefly considered displaying her embalmed body in the triumph instead. Advisors ultimately persuaded him that this would violate even Roman standards of sacrilege. Denied the spectacle he wanted, Octavian turned to retaliation. He allowed Cleopatra to be buried with royal honors beside Mark Antony, as she requested in a final letter. But this concession was paired with a systematic campaign to erase her legacy. Statues of Cleopatra across Alexandria were torn down. Her name was chiseled from public inscriptions. Temples and monuments associated with her reign were altered or destroyed. More enduring than physical destruction was the campaign of narrative control. Octavian and the historians who followed his lead reshaped Cleopatra's image for generations. She was no longer remembered as a capable ruler or skilled political strategist. Instead, she became a caricature, a foreign seductress, a manipulative woman whose beauty corrupted noble Roman men. This portrayal served a clear purpose. It justified Rome's conquest of Egypt. It framed Octavian's victory as a moral necessity, and it reinforced Roman anxieties about female autonomy and Eastern power. The fate of Cleopatra's children exposes the final hypocrisy of Octavian's promises. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus vanish from the historical record shortly after their mother's death. Historians debate whether they were quietly executed, exiled, or died of illness while in Roman custody. Their disappearance speaks volumes. Only Cleopatra Selene survived, and only because Octavian found political value in her. She was married to Juba II of Mauritania, a client king installed by Rome. Through this marriage, the last living heir of the Ptolemaic dynasty was transformed into an instrument of Roman foreign policy. Even mercy, when it came, was a form of control. The story that survives of Cleopatra's final days is not an objective record. It is a narrative shaped by the victors. The image of a queen dying gracefully by a sacred serpent serves multiple ideological goals. It romanticizes the death of an enemy, making her less threatening to history. It obscures the realities of captivity, psychological torment, and coercion. And it allows Rome to present itself as magnanimous, as though Cleopatra were granted the dignity of choosing her end. The less familiar accounts tell a harsher story. During the final 11 days of her life, Cleopatra was systematically stripped of everything that had defined her existence. Her political power was gone. Her autonomy was eliminated. Her dignity was eroded through public humiliation and constant surveillance. She was subjected to emotional blackmail through threats against her children. Even her body became a site of control, watched, examined, and regulated by her captors. The fact that she managed, in the end, to reclaim a fragment of agency is often framed as a moral victory. But this interpretation ignores the context. Cleopatra's choice was not between life and death. It was between dying on her own terms or being paraded alive through Rome as a spectacle of conquest. This is not a story of triumph. It is a case study in how absolute power operates, how it turns even death into political theater. Cleopatra's legacy was shaped as much by what followed her death as by her actions in life. For centuries, she was viewed almost entirely through Roman eyes. The exotic temptress, the dangerous woman whose allure undermined rational Roman virtue. This portrayal was never accidental. It reinforced Roman cultural superiority, justified imperial expansion, and warned against women who wielded power independently. Only with modern re-examination of primary sources, Egyptian records, and archaeological evidence has a more accurate picture begun to emerge. Cleopatra was a competent administrator, a sophisticated political strategist, a scholar fluent in multiple languages. She ruled within a deeply patriarchal world, using every tool available to preserve her kingdom and her dynasty. The location of Cleopatra's tomb remains unknown. Octavian recorded that she was buried beside Mark Antony somewhere near Alexandria, but no definitive site has ever been identified. Some scholars believe Octavian deliberately obscured the location to prevent it from becoming a focal point for resistance or pilgrimage. Others suggest earthquakes, floods, and centuries of construction erased all traces. There is also a darker possibility. that Cleopatra was never granted the honorable burial Octavian claimed, and that her body was disposed of in a far more ignominious manner as a final act of punishment. More than 2,000 years later, Cleopatra remains one of the most recognizable figures in history. Yet what most people know about her is myth layered upon propaganda. Her final days were not poetic. They were marked by fear, humiliation, and the gradual realization that no escape was possible. Her death, often portrayed as elegant defiance, was in reality an act of desperation. The last form of control available to a woman who had spent her life navigating power, only to find herself completely at the mercy of an enemy who showed none. The image that survives is powerful and deeply misleading. For centuries, Cleopatra's story has been filtered through layers of Roman propaganda, theatrical retellings, and romantic fantasy. The result is a queen frozen in myth, detached from the brutal reality of her last days. What is often forgotten is that Cleopatra did not lose her kingdom because she was reckless or naive. She lost because she stood at the intersection of forces far larger than any individual. By the time Octavian defeated her, Rome was no longer a republic struggling for balance. It was becoming an empire. And empires do not tolerate rivals, especially those who rule independently, command immense wealth, and possess legitimate dynastic authority. Cleopatra represented a different model of power. She ruled not as a Roman client, but as a sovereign monarch in her own right. She governed a complex economy. She spoke multiple languages. She understood diplomacy at a level few of her contemporaries could match. Her alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not acts of seduction alone, as Roman writers would later claim. They were calculated political strategies designed to preserve Egypt's autonomy in an increasingly hostile world. When those strategies failed, the punishment was absolute. The final 11 days of Cleopatra's life stripped away any illusion of honorable conquest. There was no respectful treatment of a defeated queen, no dignified surrender. Instead, there was surveillance, coercion, psychological pressure, the deliberate use of her children as leverage. Her captivity was not merely imprisonment. It was a sustained effort to break her will and convert her body into a symbol of Roman domination. The triumph Octavian envisioned was not just a celebration of military victory. It was a warning. To parade Cleopatra alive in chains through Rome would have sent a message to every ruler, every province, and every ambitious woman within the empire's reach. This is what happens to those who challenge imperial authority. Cleopatra understood that message perfectly, and she refused to become it. Her decision to die was not driven by vanity or theatrical impulse. It was a final strategic calculation made within impossibly narrow constraints. By removing herself from Octavian's control, she denied him the symbolic victory he sought. In death, she accomplished what she could no longer achieve in life. She limited the narrative power of her conqueror. Octavian's response reveals just how deeply that defiance cut. His fury at Cleopatra's death was not performative, it was practical. Without her alive, his triumph was incomplete. The East could be conquered militarily, but its queen had escaped his grasp. That loss had to be compensated for in another way. So Octavian reshaped the story. Cleopatra became a cautionary tale. Her intelligence was reduced to cunning, her political acumen reframed as manipulation, her sovereignty dismissed as decadence. The narrative was simple and effective. Rome had not crushed a capable ruler. It had rescued the world from a dangerous woman. This version of events proved durable. Roman historians repeated it. Medieval writers embellished it. Renaissance artists eroticized it. Modern films dramatized it. Each retelling pushed Cleopatra further from the historical woman and deeper into symbolic abstraction. Meanwhile, tangible evidence of her rule was systematically erased, her monuments destroyed, her inscriptions removed, her administrative reforms forgotten. What survived did so largely through hostile sources written by men invested in justifying her defeat. The fate of her children underscores how total that defeat was. The disappearance of Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus is not an accident of history. It reflects deliberate silencing. Whether they were executed, exiled, or allowed to fade into obscurity, their removal ensured that no alternative lineage could challenge Roman authority in Egypt. Cleopatra Selene's survival, often framed as mercy, was conditional and calculated. Raised in Rome and married into a client kingdom, she was both spared and neutralized. Her lineage was absorbed, controlled, rendered harmless. In this sense, Cleopatra's story did not end with her death. It continued through the manipulation of memory itself. The mystery of her tomb remains unresolved, and perhaps intentionally so. A known burial site could have become a place of resistance, remembrance, or reverence. By obscuring its location, Octavian ensured Cleopatra would have no physical center of legacy, no focal point around which an alternative narrative could form. Or perhaps the truth is darker. Perhaps the honors Octavian claimed to grant her were another fiction, another carefully crafted line in a longer campaign of image control. Without physical evidence, uncertainty itself becomes part of the punishment. More than 2,000 years later, what remains is a fragmented record and a powerful myth. But within those fragments, a clearer picture emerges. Cleopatra was not destroyed because she was weak. She was destroyed because she was dangerous to an emerging empire. Her final days expose the human cost of imperial ambition. They show how conquest operates not only on battlefields, but in private chambers, through whispered threats rather than drawn swords. They reveal how power seeks not just obedience, but humiliation. Not just victory, but spectacle. Cleopatra's death is often framed as an ending. In reality, it marked a transition. With her gone, Egypt ceased to be a kingdom and became a province. Its wealth flowed into Roman hands. Its political traditions were dismantled. The Mediterranean world entered a new phase, dominated by a single authority. And yet, despite everything done to erase her, Cleopatra endures. She endures not because of myth, but because of the questions her story forces us to confront. Questions about power, about gender, about who gets to write history and who is written out of it. Her story challenges the narratives imposed by victors and reminds us that historical truth is often buried beneath layers of intention. Cleopatra's last act was not beautiful. It was not serene. It was born of terror, grief, and a clear understanding of what awaited her if she lived. That reality does not diminish her legacy. It sharpens it. To see Cleopatra clearly is to confront an uncomfortable truth. Intelligence and competence do not guarantee survival in systems built on domination. Agency can be stripped away with terrifying efficiency. Even the most powerful individuals can be reduced to symbols against their will. The romantic image of Cleopatra dying gracefully by a serpent's bite is easier to accept than the truth. The truth forces us to confront cruelty without ornament, power without restraint, and a woman who fought to the very end with the only means left to her. Cleopatra was not defeated in a single moment. She was dismantled piece by piece until death became the last remaining assertion of self. And that is why her story still matters. Not as legend, not as fantasy, but as a warning.